Hey everyone, and welcome back. In this video I would like to tell you a bit about one of my favorite concepts in web development. And now that I think about it, it's not actually a concept but a technique, or could be even a concept, and that is lazy loading. In this video, to be more precise, we'll see how Webpack implements lazy loading. I have prepared a small example, but before we dive into it, I would like to clarify some fundamental concepts of Webpack that will be useful in this little journey of ours on lazy loading. The first concept is a chunk. What is a chunk? Well, a chunk is a file. First and foremost, it is a file that has been generated by Webpack as a result of the bundling process. So initially you have your app divided into modules, then Webpack will run its bundling process on it, and what you get as a result is simply a bunch of files. Could be more, could be less, but there are some files there. Those files are the chunks, and those chunks is actually what is being served, maybe to a browser or in different environment. So they are crucial. A chunk will contain some modules of your initial app, as well as some generated code, also known as runtime code, which will be used by Webpack to implement or to achieve its magic. Concretely, in this video, we'll see some of that runtime code which is necessary to achieve lazy loading. Then, what I would like to briefly touch on is how to create chunks. Well, if you have worked a bit with Webpack in the past, you'll see that, or you'll know that you can create chunks with the import function. For instance, in this example, after clicking the button, we will lazy load the async lib.js file that you see here, and then we will invoke the foo method that it exports, which is this one. Okay, so we've seen how chunks are created and what a chunk is. Now let's see it in action. For that, I'll go to the small example here, and then and now you see some bunch of logs, and those come from the modules that are contained within this chunk or this initial chunk. So let me get back to this diagram. I should maybe bring them side by side. Why not? Yeah, finally. Okay, great, finally. So if we check the network tab after we click refresh, we'll see the main.js. This is the main chunk, this file here essentially, or this item, this component here on the left. And this file is the entry point chunk. It will contain a lot of essential runtime code besides the module it contains. So in this case, what I've highlighted on the right, you can see on the left, which is local lib. This entire file is essentially index.js. I mean, it will contain the code that is part of that module, as well as some other files, foo.js and foo.dep.js. And on the right, if you take a look, we first have the modules that are contained within this chunk, this main.js chunk, which is once again the entry point chunk, which means it will be loaded as an entry for your app. This means that this chunk will never be lazy loaded. There could be cases, but I'm not aware of them. So at this point, I will simply state that this entry point chunk will never be lazy loaded. This chunk 1, on the other hand, will be lazy loaded. Okay, now after the chunks, after the modules have been declared, we will see until the end of this file a lot of runtime code. This code is necessary to keep track of loaded modules, to cache the modules, so that when, for example, you want to import a module that has been imported before, you will simply get the export. Okay, and then you have code for lazy loading, which you will see in a minute. And depending on what features you want Webpack to use for you, you will have more runtime code here. Okay, now just before we dive into the runtime code, I would simply like you to notice the network tab. So I'll be clicking on click for lazy loading, and we'll see what happens. First of all, you should notice that an HTTP request has been done, and it is indeed one way. There could be more ways to achieve lazy loading, but by default, Webpack will load files via HTTP, and we'll see exactly how it does it. But for now, let's just observe that a new HTTP request has been done for a file. This is chunk1.js, which is again a chunk, which also means that it is a file. And as we say, the file will contain modules that are part of the initial app, as well as some runtime code. This chunk is very small compared to the other one, because this chunk is actually an async chunk, not a runtime, not an entry point chunk. The entry point chunk will have to contain code that is necessary for the entry point of your app. Concretely, the entry point chunk main.js will contain code, runtime code, that is necessary in order to achieve lazy loading, and we'll see that in a minute. But for now, we can see that chunk1.js, which is again a chunk, has some runtime code. This is necessary to be this code that I'm just highlighting. This will be necessary in order for Webpack to integrate those chunks, basically to, in the end, to connect them so that you can use the modules that have been lazily loaded. And you can also see that this chunk can also contains modules. In this case, it would be async lib.js. Okay. Now let's refresh one more time. And now let's put a breakpoint right here. If we quickly compare it to our initial code, we can see that the import function has been replaced by this let's say mysterious function webpack require.e. Let's see what happens when we click the button. I will zoom in just a bit more. Okay, now let's go with the breakpoint. So first of all, we see that we have an ID here, which is 0. I don't know where that comes from yet. So we can assume that E comes from insert chunk. F it's an object, and then we iterate to this object, and we iterate to the keys of this object, and then we invoke whatever those keys provide. In this case, because I'm quite familiar with this topic, by default Webpack will have just one method attached to the F object, and that is J, which I think stands for JSONP, which is JSON with padding. So we'll skip right through it. We don't have to bother with too much details for now. We can see that Webpack maintains a map, or an object to be more precise, with the installed chunks. So we can see once again why runtime code is necessary, and why runtime code is a lot for the entry point chunk, which is main.js. So among other things, this runtime code will ensure that for example, we won't make multiple HTTP requests every time we want to require the same chunk, among other things. So we'll first check if this chunk with the ID of 0 has been loaded before. It also says that 0 means already installed, which is not the case for now. Then we simply go through the process, and there is a lot of code which might need some, let's say, careful examination in order to be fully understood. But for now, let's just walk through it. Here we're just creating a promise, and we save the resolve and the reject methods or functions for later, for when the chunk will be, for when the chunk will be ready. And this means after the HTTP request for a JS file has been ready, because if you have noticed, or you might have noticed that essentially lazy loading chunks means loading JS files via HTTP when it's needed. The way you can do this could be multiple, but in this case, let's see how webpack does it. So we'll skip through some, let's say, clever logic by webpack. We can just examine this as is. First, we get the URL for that chunk, which is in this case chunk 1, and now you can see its absolute path. This URL is useful because it will be used to fetch that file via HTTP, so that's why we need it. Then we have a callback, which is invoked when loading has ended. Okay, and this is also, by the way, a very clever thing to declare an error here, so that when an error happens, because the error, if it is to happen, it will happen in a different context, so you won't have the actual stack trace, and that's why you create now the error synchronously. So this is once again a very clever thing done by webpack. Okay, so we have the callback, and then we stumble across another method, which is .l. Let's see what happens. So it will check if it is in progress. It is not the case. So this is basically the magic that I wanted to show you in essence. The way webpack achieves lazy loading by default is by using JSONP, which entails, if you are aware with the concept, to fetch files via the script tag. So what webpack will do here is to essentially create a script tag, as you can see here, which will have the URL that maps to the chunk, which is again the file that we want to lazy load, to load on demand. And then when webpack and then when the script has been fetched, we will invoke this onScript complete callback. Once again, webpack does a few more things that are beyond of what we want to highlight now. These are worth exploring, but I just want to show you how webpack achieves lazy loading, which is in essence by creating and this is by default, by creating a script tag that matches to the URL that maps to the chunk that we want to lazy load, and then after the chunk has been loaded, we simply integrate the modules of that async chunk into the main chunk, and then that module is available, and this is how lazy loading is achieved basically. For the sake of completeness, I would like to just finish the whole thing, and then we'll wrap up. So so it seems that after the module has been fetched and executed, this script will this callback will be invoked. Okay, we have some done functions, which we'll see again which function is about. So basically, we have these steps. We want to fetch a chunk lazily. We create a script tag with its URL. We fetch the JS file via HTTP with the JSONP. Then we execute the module or the file that has been fetched. Then this function, this callback on script complete, will be called. It will do its logic here, and then what happens is that this done function will be called as well when loading has ended. And yeah, here basically it is doing a different check. Yeah, and basically this is how it's done. There is one more thing that I think is very clever by Webpack, and if I know how many minutes this video it has, maybe it has at least 15, but I would simply like to show you this one last thing, which is this one, this self chunk exploring Webpack. This is the JSONP magic, because as you see, this self Webpack chunk exploring Webpack is being used here as you see it, but it has been defined, so it has been used as you see it in the async chunk, but it has been defined very cleverly here in the main chunk. Okay, so basically what this entire thing will do, I don't think it's worth spending the time explaining it, because I think the best way you can actually understand it is by going with the debugger yourself. It's also the fact that I think I've forgotten the exact details about it. But anyways, what this does is that when the chunk or the file that corresponds to the async chunk is being executed, which means it has been fetched and then it will be executed. So when it will be executed, it will invoke this push method. Okay, this one, but this one is also known as monkey patched, which means the push method on self Webpack chunk exploring Webpack, which is once again called here. This push method is monkey patched by this Webpack JSONP callback, which is a different function, of course, which is this one here, and this will ensure that the installed chunks map or object will be populated. Okay, so I know this has been a lot and maybe some things are not very clear, but what I want you to take away from this is that by default Webpack will lazy load chunks via a simple script tag, which will contain the URL that maps to the async chunk. Then the chunk or the file, the async file, will be fetched via HTTP. Then once it is fetched, it will be executed, and after it has been executed, first of all, the chunk ID will be saved to an object, to a global object, so that the HTTP request won't be made again when the chunk will be required, maybe after a second click. Okay, and then after the chunk ID of the newly fetched file will be saved, then the modules that this file contains will be integrated into the main app, so that basically those modules can be used as well. Okay, this was how lazy loading is implemented by Webpack, and if you want to explore more about how this works, I would simply recommend you to just clone Webpack locally and go through the debugger, and basically that's I think that's the best way to learn such tools, and it's also fun, I would say. Okay, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.